So welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight. I'm Judith Kober, and as you can see, Wayne McRoy is back, and we are going to talk about horned deities and snake deities today. Because no matter where you are in this world, any culture you pick, you will come across horned deities and snake deities. So Wayne, thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me back on again. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. And this should be a good topic. This should be an interesting one. I have just recently published my latest book called The Demic of Pan, Breaking the Natural Order, which touches upon one of the horned deities, Pan. So we could touch on some of those archetypes and things like that, and dig a little deeper into that.
So what exactly brought this on for you to, with everything that is going on, it's not, let's say, the obvious topic to pick. So why did you do that? What was the reason?
Well, I started recognizing some overarching mythological archetypes being used to leverage the public consciousness in certain directions. And this has been going on for, for years now, for many years. But over the course of the past 2 years, it all became very clear to me what they were doing and what archetypes they were playing on in order to invoke different ideas into the world. And what this equates to is the fact that these people in positions of power in this world, the ones that control things, I like to call them the dark occultists who run things, because it's a pretty apt way to describe them, because they are occultists that are using these things, these different ideas for dark purposes. So what I recognized is that they're leveraging certain ideas, more subjective type ideas, to control people's behaviors on a public level here. And this harkens back to ideas that have been discussed in various books and white papers put out by people within the power circles of the establishment that discuss this very thing. So just right out of the gate, I like to preface all of what I'm going to say by just going back and looking at one of these type documents. And this was a Stanford Institute study that was put together by some cyberneticists and various people in positions in think tank groups. And this is it's a book called The Changing Images of Man. And in The Changing Images of Man, essentially they talk about the way that they could control social behavior is through using subjective ideas, because it's not always something that they could pin down as an objective, quantifiable thing in order to steer people's behaviors, because there's just so much in the realm of psychology and stuff like that that's not necessarily easily quantifiable. So what they do is they lean on subjective ideas, and they use ideas like metaphors and mythologies and archetypes to leverage people's behaviors in certain ways, because they recognize and they've documented that these different ideas, like especially the ideas inherent with mythology and mythological archetypes, they actually have a very real effect on the psyche of the human being, and it affects people on an unconscious level, so they don't see it on the conscious level. So they use these ideas to steer people's behaviors, and they recognize that this is a powerful tool that they could use to influence people's behaviors. So essentially, the whole premise of the new book I wrote is the fact that they took some of these archetypes and have leveraged them in a certain way in order to establish a new mythology for our modern sensibilities here, for the human being to attach to. And that's, one of the reasons why they titled their book The Changing Images of Man, because what they're attempting to do is steer the image of man into something that they want. And they recognize that mankind recognizes something primal within the archetypes of these mythological stories and things like that, that resonates with them. So this gives man an impression or an image of who he is and what the universe around him is and what his place in it is. So they use these ideas to steer or shift people's ideas about these things into a direction that they want, as far as what their place is here, what their role is, who they are, what their identity is. So they take these ideas in order to modify the social behaviors of people. So that's what the premise of that whole book is, and that's why they called it The Changing Images of Man, because that implies that there's an active strategy to change what it is that mankind thinks about himself and the universe around him and the existence or nature of God, so to say. So that's what they've done. So they've used these ideas, and there were some very famous people that were in on this study, this Stanford Institute study. One of them being Joseph Campbell, which many people might be familiar with. He was one of the preeminent mythological gurus of like the last century here. He understood mythological archetypes very well. And he's the one that came up with the idea and outlined the steps in the hero's journey as far as the storytelling aspects of things too. So he was one of the ones that had a lot of influence in that study, as well as Margaret Mead, which I'm sure many people have heard of, who was a prominent cyberneticist. So, you know, you have a lot of these people with a lot of social influence on the think tank board of directors of this project that they were looking at. So these are important foundational ideas to touch upon before we even get into the crux of what the archetypes represent and that kind of thing. Just so people understand, this is not just something that's, you know, that I'm imagining like that's happening out there. It's acknowledged. It's a real thing, and it's acknowledged within different think tank papers like this. And there's more than just that one, but that one's a primary example that I like to cite for this kind of an idea. So when people look at this stuff, they could understand, yes, this is an acknowledged thing. There's people in the power structure that will admit that they use these mythological archetypes to influence people's behaviors. And, you know, it's documented. So it's not just me saying they do this. They really do. And it's well documented. And that doesn't even touch upon like the occult angle of this. And we'll get into that too.
Yeah, okay. So when it comes to horns, usually what we get in terms of information is that the horns represent fertility, they represent power, they represent strength. So would you agree with that? Or during your line of work, did you figure out that there is a meaning behind the meaning?
The horns, well, there's many different traits that are associated with the horns, all of those things you mentioned. And a lot of this ties back to the zodiacal signs and stuff too. And a lot of what I've identified has to do with the changing of ages, right? We're allegedly exiting the age of Pisces and going into the age of Aquarius. That's what they're saying. And a lot of these ideas tie directly to that. Now, I would equate the idea of the horns with the archetype that has been leveraged here within the past 2 years in order to make a real world change here, to change the way that society operates. They've utilized a figure that represents this horned god idea with the horns, and they chose Pan, right? And, you know, we could see that shortly before the onset of this scam demic that's been going on, they changed the definition of what qualifies as a pandemic. And they did that for the sole purpose of being able to invoke this archetype into it. And we'll get a little deeper into that because there's a lot more connections than just that. But shortly before this whole thing really took off here in the world, they changed the qualifications of what qualifies as a pandemic so that this thing would fit that bill, because that's what they needed in order to leverage the archetype that they were looking for, to leverage the idea, the mythology of the horned god, Pan, which represented an age past. And, you know, actually also in a dualistic fashion, represents a future age as well. And this is some of the strategy that they've employed here on an occult level for trying to leverage these energies. So that being the case, I'll identify first those two ages, which he represents. Pan represented the age of Aries, the ram, right? So that was back the age before Pisces. And we'll get a little more into this whole dynamic later because this will become important as we break down more of these ideas. But he also represents the future age, the age just beyond Aquarius, the age of Capricorn, the goat. And the goat symbolism is everywhere today, and we'll break that down a little bit more too as we go on. because that's also important to see just how long this whole thing has been pre-planned and has been actually shaping the worldview of people for a long time now in very subtle ways. And this is how the game is played. They play the long game with this stuff. So they set these tropes and archetypes into motion well before they put it into action, like the actual how should we say, operational phase of the plan. Before they put that into action, they pre-program us with different archetypes. So that's kind of what I demonstrate in the book with this pan archetype, how everything that's been happening since at least 1882 has been leading up to this whole thing. And it's been manipulated in a way to represent this pan archetype for various reasons, which we'll touch upon here as we go.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, when you look at it from that angle, there is no other deity better suited to, represent this entire nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, it's Pan, right? This was the old Greek god of nature, the Greek god of fertility, all of these different ideas. And essentially what they've done with the archetype is they've inverted it for their modern use of it. So it's the inversion of the Pan archetype that's been leveraged here. And people might better understand this symbol as something called the Baphomet or Baphomet. This is the inversion principle of Pan. See, when you look at the representation, the image of the old god Pan, well, he had the upper half of a human, the head of a human, and the feet of a goat. Well, Baphomet has the head of a goat. I mean, it's the total inversion of this. And these dark occultists that run this place, they're all about this inversion principle because it's all about inverting the natural order or perverting the natural order to them. So that's what they're all about.
Baphomet has also breasts, yeah?
Yes, it's an androgyne type of a figure. It's an androgynous figure that has both the representations of the masculine and the feminine traits. And that also has an important tie to things going on in the world today as well. That's why they've taken this idea and used the inversion principle of it, because they're steering social archetypes in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So another horned deity that comes to my mind and that is pretty famous is this Cernunnos. And what I find interesting with that depiction is the pose of his legs. And if you look at it, it reminds me a little bit of a Buddha pose, how he is holding the legs. And then he has something like a ring in his right hand, and in his left hand, he is holding a snake. And that is from the Celtic culture. So what do you make of that? First of all, does he remind you of a Buddha as well, the way he is depicted there? Or would you say that's just your fantasy?
No, I would say there's definite parallels there. And we see this thing all across times and cultures, right? So the Cernunnos idea, this is actually who many researchers would claim that the organization CERN was actually named after. And once again, this is invoking that goat archetype, right? This is an important thing in our modern era. So this is just another representation of the same archetype, so to say. The same archetype as Pan. It's an archetype. It may be a different culture and a different god, so to say, or different mythology, but it's representing the same core ideas. And it's the same thing with this Cernunnos. It does represent kind of some of the Buddhic ideas are caught up in that, as well as some of the older tropes, like he's holding the serpent in his hand. Well, the serpent has always represented wisdom and also guile, because many of the secret society groups and stuff like that teach that guile and wisdom together are both important ideas, that mankind only started to learn knowledge and wisdom and gnosis, so to say, through the use of guile initially, that it was the use of guile that was one of the things that offset man down this path, this path of free will. There's a lot of these ideas caught up in those type of representations there too. But yeah, I would say by and large, Cernunnos, there is that Buddhic aspect. And like I said, this does reach across all cultures. So many things caught up in the Buddha idea of the East. Well, that's encapsulated in these more Druidic type ideas in the Cernunnos type of thing. So many of the same philosophies are at the core of all of these things, and they do transcend time and culture. It's just different names that they put on it, and they represent different natural energies, so to say, these different gods and archetypes, so to say. So it's the same archetype in play. It's just being utilized a little bit differently depending on the time and culture. But this is also a lead up into things that are going on today, which I directly equate to the age change. Many people in the occult circles and the power circles at the top here understood and were actually waiting for this time, right? Because they understand the principle of the changeover of ages a little better than we do. And they're trying to manipulate some of these natural energies that are inherent in this particular time of the cycle to leverage it in a way that benefits them, but doesn't really largely benefit the rest of mankind. And that's just what, my studies have shown. This is the idea that's being used here right now. They're trying to steer things in a direction that pretty much lock us into materialism, right? And we've seen the onset of this since the Industrial Revolution set off. It's been a further, downhill path with that all through time here. And now that we're entering what they call the fourth industrial revolution, they're really ramping it up because it's all about getting trapped in this hyper materialist viewpoint here. The gross materialism that our society is based on, consumerism, all of these things just bound up in physical needs and wants. So that's essentially what they've been trying to steer things towards with some of these archetypes. And you could see how it's a far cry from what the original intention of the archetype was, right? Because these are supposed to represent gods of nature. Mm-hmm. But like I said, it's all about the inversion principle with these dark occultists who run things. So that's why they've leveraged this stuff in that way. They're using the inversion of the archetype to steer society kind of backwards, in a sense. So away from a spiritual awakening and more towards, in no more subtler terms than enslavement in the material, right? Mm-hmm. So that's essentially what they're trying to engineer because it benefits these people at the top of the power chain. That's exactly what they're looking for. They want to be the gods of this place, and they see that being possible, the use of technologies and by leveraging these old alchemical archetypes against the masses who are largely unaware of them.
Mm. Yeah. On the other hand, I would say I can't see how it would work any other way because everything is inverted here. Yeah, I mean, debt is money, and health.
Yeah, I think George Orwell said it best, didn't he?
What?
I think George Orwell said it best, didn't he? Mm. Ignorance is strength, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, all these ideas have been thrown in our face all of our lives. But we've never really truly recognized them until now because we're living in an unprecedented time. And I think that's what this all comes down to. We're living at this nexus point between two ages, right? So what we would recognize from the old Hermetic teachings is this is all part of the natural cycle of things. We knew, this age change would be coming and, we want to be prepared for it. But the thing that this age change represents for most of mankind and for those, in positions of power who are trying to leverage things, they have two different goals in mind, right? What the natural ramifications of this age change should be and what the natural cycle would entail is this should be a spiritual elevation of mankind, the Great Awakening, right? We hear that all the time being said, the Great Awakening. That's what the Age of Aquarius is supposed to represent, the Great Awakening, the fruition of all the things that were set in place through the Age of Pisces for the elevation of mankind as a whole, the spiritual elevation, the ability for mankind to step into his full potential as what it means to be fully human and to embrace that in a more spiritual sense. But what's happened here is there are powers in this world that have tried to usurp this, and what they're attempting to do is leverage these different natural energies in a way, in an inverse way, to what the natural fulfillment of this would be. They're trying to invert it another way, and like I said, bring about this materialist view. So what they're attempting to do is bypass this great awakening and instead introduce to us what they call the Great Reset, which would further double down on many of the materialist ideas that have been presented to us since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And in so doing, it's trying to lock us into this material place where we don't elevate spiritually. So it's all about essentially dumbing down mankind and quelling his spiritual awakening in a certain way here. And they're doing this by invoking the archetype here of Pan in its inverse way. And how they're attempting to do this, or what they're attempting to do with this is bypass the energetic principles of the Age of Aquarius and steer us towards the energetic principles of the Age of Capricorn. So I should probably do a little explanation as to some of this here, so we don't lose people, because so essentially, all right, when we look back at this age, the Age of Pisces, we have to think in philosophical terms. And this is hard for people in our modern scientific paradigm, right? It's hard for people to think outside of the box. So we have to go back to some of the older ways of thinking, the alchemical ways or philosophical ways of thinking. So when we're thinking of the age, right, that we're living in, or we're transitioning from, this is the Age of Pisces. Well, the Age of Pisces is a water sign. So think in the terms of the four classical elements: fire, earth, air, and water. Pisces is a water sign. So if we look at things that have come about to fruition throughout all of the social order during this Age of Pisces, we see all of these water ideas are inherent here. Maritime law, all our systems of law, and even the straw man identity is all based upon maritime law. All these maritime ideas, nautical ideas, even within the alleged space programs themselves, they use nautical language to identify some of these things. So we see this, it's kind of an overarching idea of the time. Even a lot of the technologies, one of the major technologies of this age has been sailing ships, great sailing ships to go across the oceans to trade and stuff like that. So all of these ideas are bound to that elemental phase of water. Now, in the natural cycles of time here, as the Hermetic principles would point out, the next one in line would be the Age of Aquarius, which is an age of air, right? And before we progress here further, in the philosophical sense of the four classical elements, you'll find that the philosophical elements of water and earth are generally considered to be material elements or bound to this physical plane. And the elements of fire and air are bound to the spiritual plane and represent spiritual things. So we're moving from the Age of Water, which is a physical, so to say, a material world age, into its advancement into the spiritual age, this enlightenment phase, right? With Aquarius being an age of air, of elemental air. So what's actually being done here from this point of view is they're trying to take a principle, which I'll describe here later when we're done, so you can get a better view of what I'm talking about here. What they're attempting to do is they're trying to bypass this energetic principle of Aquarius, the air age, the age of spirituality. They're trying to bypass that and get to the Age of Capricorn, the energetic principles of Capricorn, which Capricorn is in Earth age. So Earth, once again, bound to the material, the physical, right, rather than a spiritual advancement. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to invoke that energetic archetype to keep people bound here, right? Not thinking in spiritual terms. And that's why we see many of the things going on in the world today that we do, like the push for atheism, the push for many of these different ideals in certain ways. So, and the thing is, I always caution people, even if you think what I'm telling you is nonsense here and you don't believe it, what you need to understand is there's people in positions of power that very much believe this stuff and act upon it, and the things they do to act upon it will affect us all. So it's good to understand what their point of view is, what their reasoning is for doing these things. So by and large, the things that the are being done right now are being done to try to bypass this spiritual awakening of sorts and lock us into a more material paradigm. And that's what things like the ideology of metaverse are all about, right? Locking us into a digital system, a much more controllable system bound to the material. So that's essentially what they're trying to do here. And, you know, I'll get into more specific details about this. I hope I'm not losing too many people on these ideas, because a lot of this, it requires you to step outside and think outside the box, because we've been trained to think basically of everything in the context of what they call scientific method, which is one method of analyzing data. But see, it's not the only method. And what our modern culture has done is they've tried to equate this as the only method for quantifying and being able to understand things. So the way they see it, if you can't count it, if you can't quantify it, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And that's how they've taught us to think. But many of these ideas are more subjective or experiential, and you can't really objectively measure them or quantify them in various ways. So it's hard for people to analyze that type of data in this way, because we're taught to think in the strictly physical aspects of it. So it's hard to get a hold of some of these abstract ideas. And that's the thing. A lot of it's abstract, subjective, and experiential rather than objective, measurable, and quantifiable, which is what they seek to do, is they seek to count and measure everything to make it more controllable. That's why they try to steer us towards this more material paradigm of things, because that's easier for them to control. But you know, they do acknowledge and understand that there are other avenues of thought that need to be taken into consideration for these approaches of things they do, and they want us to be wholly ignorant of that. So that's the whole point here. That's why they've tried to discredit the ideas associated with like astrology and alchemy and all these older philosophies in the modern age. They want us to think of that as nonsensical, right? It doesn't exist. It's backwards thinking. That's how they try to indoctrinate us in the modern era. But that nothing could be further from the truth. These are important ideas, and they've been around since the dawn of mankind for a reason. I think the ancient civilizations understood many principles of how this world really works and natural principles much better than we do today. So, you know, that being the case, it's important to grasp a hold of some of these ideas to see a way forward. And I think that's one of the important things going on today, is there's people like you and myself out there trying to make people aware, hey, you need to take a step back and look at some of this information and just think about it, right? Because that's what's missing in society today, critical thought on many levels. It's all about reactivity. They're all about just invoking a reaction from people, a measurable, controllable reaction, right? And that's, you know, stems back to the ideas we were just talking about. So that's why they try to do these things. They want you in that reactive state, that animalistic mindset, that flight or fight response. Because if you're doing that and you're not thinking critically, then you'll just react on a primal emotional level to whatever stimulus they give you. Like take, for example, you know, now they're pushing the gun control agenda here again by using these different types of strategies, so to say. Let's you know, go and we'll go through media and we'll push all of these shooting narratives all over the place to try to take people's rights away from them again. And it's always invariably about stuff like this. It's about control more than anything. So that's the whole point here. You see how they will manipulate the public mindset with stuff like that. And, you know, that's part and parcel of what's going on.
You know what amazes me time and again? All these people who dream up those crooked ideas and all their secret societies and mystery schools and what have you. Say what you want, they are not stupid, but sometimes, and that is, how can you be so stupid and believe you can skip an entire age?
That's just part and parcel of their hubris, though. That's the thing. And I think they're just trying to see, when you think of the ages, right? We're thinking, you think in strictly terms of what are the positions of the stars in the sky? That's what's supposed to
Mhm.
constitute what is the age. Well, they're looking at it in the archetypal form, right? And that's how we have to take a step back and look at it. It's an energetic principle. Think of it as nothing more than an energetic principle, not necessarily a physical description of a thing. See, and that's where they have us bound up in this whole idea of everything needs this physical description, this way to be measured and quantified. That's the same thing going on with that. It doesn't mean that the energies aren't prevalent there. They certainly are. It's just they're trying to grasp hold of this other energetic principle, and they have a small window of opportunity to do that, from
Mhm.
what I've been able to identify. And we'll get a little bit into that here because this is an important idea too. At a crossover point between two ages, there's a nexus point, right? Wherein things are malleable. Energetic principles are malleable at that time. And the dark occultists in charge of this place are trying to leverage on that, but their window of opportunity is running short now. So that's why they're pushing so hard with stuff. But that's essentially what they're doing. And this falls back to something I discuss in the new book, and it's a very important principle. And I think I'll describe it here to the listeners so that they could follow along. This nexus point in the crossover between two ages is represented by a principle that I named because I couldn't find anybody else really talking about it at the time and never heard it described before, but it's a principle that I call the Pan-Christ dynamic. So to explain this a little further, we'll go back and we'll look at one of the old stories about Pan, the god Pan, once again, to see how this all plays out. So if you go back to the writings of Plutarch, you find Plutarch tells the story of a ship captain named Themis, who was sailing his ship around the Isle of Paxi back toward Greece. So as he's sailing his ship, he hears a disembodied voice call out his name from the open sea. Now, little did he realize everybody else on board the ship heard this too. He was unaware of that. So at first he ignored it, thinking maybe he was going a little bit nutsy or something or hearing things. And then the disembodied voice calls out to him again. So this time he answers. And this time the disembodied voice tells him, Themis, when you get offshore of Greece, you're going to announce to the people there that the great god Pan is dead. So he says, okay, thinking he still might be a little bit nuts and unaware that everybody else on board the ship heard this. He made a decision to himself. He said, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. He says, if I get offshore of Greece and the weather is bad or it's raining or anything like that or stormy, I'm just going to keep quiet and keep this to myself. But he says, if I get offshore of Greece and the weather's good and fair, I'll make this announcement. So eventually his ship comes offshore of Greece and there's all kinds of people milling about on the shore. So he announces loudly to the shore, the great god Pan is dead. And there was a lot of weeping and lamenting. So that's essentially the crux of the story that Plutarch tells. And this is also taken not only as a mythological tale, but it's kind of a semi-historical account. Plutarch records this as actual history. So that being the case, what many of the early Christian Gnostics and many of the early Christian theologians and Christian mystics picked up upon is that the timing of this story, this allegedly took place during the lifetime of Jesus Christ here on earth. So what this indicated to many of the early Christian mystics is this was a changing of the age, the death of the great god Pan, Pan representing the age of Aries, right, the ram. This was an announcement of a nexus point, of a changeover point between ages, from the age of Aries to the age of Pisces. So the great god Pan was dead, but Christ was alive. Messiah was, at the Advent point here on earth. So that's what they recognized with this. So this is the energetic principle that represents this crossover between ages, this nexus point, the Pan-Christ dynamic. So since then, what's essentially being done right now in the world we're living in is they're trying to invert this principle, this dynamic, this Pan-Christ dynamic. And how are they doing so? Well, back in 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a book in which he brought about the philosophical principle, the God is dead movement, right? I'm sure we've probably heard a little something about this. And there are many of the various secret society groups and mystics out there that try to equate the change of the age of Pisces to Aquarius actually occurred in 1881, 1 year earlier from when Nietzsche popularized this idea. So there's this kind of consideration there too. So, we're really not sure if we're where we're at as far as the age change goes. There's some astronomers and astrologers out there and stuff that would say, no, we're still firmly in the age of Pisces and this and that. So there's some debate as to what age it really is. And I don't think there's any way we could truly tell. But many of the occultists of the time, and one place in particular that cites the idea that the age switched in 1881, is a book called The Light of Egypt, where you could look into this. And this was an initiate,
Yeah,
a highly
I
ranked
have
initiate.
that book.
Do you? So,
Mm.
okay, so you might be a little bit familiar with what I'm talking about there then. So that's good. So they claim that the age change occurred in 1881. So 1 year later, Nietzsche comes out with this philosophy. It wasn't his original philosophy, but he really popularized the idea in a book he wrote at the time called The Gay Science. And what it is it's the God is dead idea. So, a lot of philosophers and theologians of the time had debates back and forth about it, and it largely went without much attention through the early 1900s. So at that point, what had happened is this idea was brought about later in the 1900s, in 1966, nonetheless. January 9th, 1966, the New York Times had a headline talking about the God is dead debate, and brought this idea back up into the modern parlance in modern culture. So since then, we've had all kinds of philosophical ideas about, this death of God, and this is equating to the Christian God, right? And this is what it was largely talking about, what the philosophical debate was about. Is God dead? Does mankind really need a God? And this was what Nietzsche wrote about and was concerned with. He thought, okay, with all of our advances in modern science, we don't need a God anymore, right? And that's kind of the mindset he came to with that. But he also had concerns that without a God, man would be directionless, without some kind of a God to serve. So he needed some kind of an artificial God or a new type of principle to replace God, to have any kind of direction or meaning in life. And that was what his concern was, that with, no need for a God anymore. And this is what he allegedly meant by God is dead. Man didn't need a God anymore. So he was thinking without this as a principle, man would be directionless, and this would lead to nihilism, gross nihilism. And that was his concern, and why he had actually penned that phrase. So what we see is later, in the midst of the arising of the counterculture, right, in the 1960s, this whole idea was popularized once again, the God is dead movement. So to try to further encourage man towards the gross material world, right, to disavow spiritual ideas, step away from the idea of God, and embrace this gross materialism. So that's what has been done in our society, in this time frame. So we see the rolling out of this within, the 1960s counterculture, and we see how we've slipped over the past few decades now further into this materialist paradigm, because essentially what they're trying to do is they're playing this pan-Christ dynamic in reverse, right? Now it's about bringing about the new God, right? This inversion principle of Pan, and burying the old God, like as what happened with this pan-Christ dynamic in the changeover between Aries and Pisces, right? So that was the death of Pan. Those old ideas are buried and put away. And then the Christ archetype is the primary thing in the Age of Pisces. Well, now they want to put the Christ archetype away and present something else to you. This inversion principle of Pan, which is designed to bring us further into the gross material and bypass these spiritual ideas that the Christ representation was supposed to bring about in mankind. See, the Age of Aquarius is supposed to be the fulfillment of the Christ ideas within all of mankind, the Great Awakening, so to say. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to replace that by utilizing this nexus point in the changeover of ages to redirect those energies toward the Capricorn ideas. And this is why they invoke the archetype of the goat so much in everything. I mean, look around society, the goat, the greatest of all time. People always refer to an athlete or something as the goat, the greatest of all time. All these ideas are not by accident, right? It's all in to invoke this principle. And think of it this way. What exactly is a goat? A goat is a herd animal, right? There's no individuality or no free will principle with a goat. It's a herd animal to be led in whatever way the shepherd, so to say, wants it to go. And that's what they're trying to invoke in society. That's why they're trying to leverage this principle in that way and bypass the energetic principle of the spiritual awakening, the Great Awakening, and replace it with what they call the Great Reset, which is basically setting up the pieces in a different way now within this material paradigm. In order for them to be able to better control it. It's about consolidating power and control to this power structure at the top here, and leveraging these things and essentially trying to become the gods of this world in no uncertain terms. That's what their goal is. They want to be God. They want absolute control over everything, and they want to have immortality in the physical plane here, in a physical way. And they see that as being doable with the advent of some of our modern technologies. So that's why they're pushing so hard, and they recognize the energetic principles of the time we're in, and they're trying to leverage those against us. So they're hitting us from all sides with a lot of these ideas. So that's kind of what I've discovered here in my studies, and that's what the core of the book is about. It's about these different energetic principles being used in that way.
Yeah. So before we close down the first hour, I can't help it, but I have to make that comparison, because there is one painting by Goya, and in that painting you see a group of people sitting on the ground, and in the midst sits a goat, and it is titled The Witch's Sabbath, if memory serves. So of course, with horned deities, before you can count to three, you have a lot of, visions of something called the devil, yeah, that invokes that. And so how did that happen? Why do we think the devil has wings, red skin, cloven hoof, not trident, a pitchfork? That is something. How did that? Yeah, and of course the horns. So how did that happen? Could you figure that out, when and why that happened?
Well, I think there's a lot of scholars who have looked at this, who equate that back to Dante's Inferno. I think that's where the initial image of Satan in this way, or the devil in this way, I think that's where that idea was crafted, was with that writing. And that's where a lot of people point to for that. But it does incorporate a lot of the ideas of these different horned deities and whatnot in there. And it also ties together with the archetype of the serpent. The serpent represents wisdom and guile, like I said, misdirection, like, in knowledge, wisdom, and deceit. On the other hand, it's a two-sided coin. And that's the thing. A lot of these symbols and archetypes have different attributes to them. They have good attributes and bad attributes, or what we would acknowledge as such. So that being the case, it's incorporated these ideas into this figure that they call the devil, or Satan, or Satan, which means adversary when you go back to the original root word of that. So you could equate some of these ideas back to older times and older archetypes too. If you go back to the Egyptian mythos, this would be Set, or Typhon, would be the devil idea, right? The opposition, the adversary of Osiris, right? So when we see these things, it's all hitting at the same archetype, right? It's just a different representation of that, which doesn't invalidate it as being a true thing. If anything, it actually validates it more as being a true thing, because, like I said, a lot of these ideas, they transcend time and culture. These very archetypes. So if anything, it's telling you that there's a truth inherent in these ideas, regardless of what you call them. So, if that's the case, we need to pay close attention. So once again, I think largely where the idea of this Satan or Satan figure or devil figure, where it was popularized, like this idea that we picture him as today, it harkens back to Dante's Inferno. So, that's, I think, where the uh, most people trace the roots of that thought form as being associated with this too, if I'm not mistaken. So I haven't looked deeply into that, but I recognize the archetype. I mean, the archetype transcends time and culture. So, that's the important thing.
Well, I don't find the depictions of the devil very frightening or scary. If anything, I find them a little bit ridiculous and over
Comical.
the top.
Yeah, they could be. And, that's not to diminish, say, the influence there or anything, but when it's represented as something silly, the way that it's become through modern culture, then how serious are you going to take this whole idea? And I think that that's kind of a way that these dark occultists that run things have leveraged this thing against us, because if they represent it as something silly in the modern lexicon or the modern culture, in the modern mind, then it's something people are less apt to take seriously. So they'll just disregard the idea that there might be some kind of a spiritual influence, a negative spiritual influence, and they'll just disregard that altogether. I think that's primarily what's been done with this archetype. They want us to just think, that's just silly, that's superstition, that's nonsense, right? So, they kind of push it off as that. And this is all part of the social engineering they do too.
Oh, who comes to mind as well? What is Iwas is his name, Aleister Crowley's connection to the astral world. His depiction, he looked like I don't know, an overflated gray, and then he has the horns in here, not wearing them, but very, very it looks a little
pronounced
bit
brow.
No, not brow. It's like it's up here. It looks like a very pronounced veins, something like that. But you could look at it as horns as well.
Right. Now there's several different spiritual entities that Crowley is associated with. Iwas is one of them, but I think the one you're thinking of is actually called Lam.
Okay.
That's the one that looks like the gray alien archetype.
Oh yeah. You're correct.
Yeah. So,
sorry.
But no, that's okay. I mean, but the thing is, he was allegedly also in contact with this being that was called Awas as well. So this guy, was he was a piece of work. Let's be honest. But some of the things that he put forward have helped to shape modern culture. In many ways, and that's something that was leveraged on here too. This is all part of the game that's played by these dark occultists. They took many of the ideas that he popularized and made them front and center within this counterculture movement in the 1960s. Think back of the Beatles album. Which one was it that it actually had Crowley on the cover, and they invoked a lot of these Crowleyan ideas and stuff in it. For some reason, I'm blanking on the title of it. And it's like a popular,
I know what you mean. I even have the cover in.
I could picture the cover in my mind, but I can't think of the name. Man, it's see, that's the thing. I mean, so much of this stuff, it's just so in your face all the time. It's all part of the.
Isn't that also the one where some are speculating that that is a hint that Paul McCartney is dead, that there's something like a grave on it?
Yeah, that's the same thing. You see all these ideas, and it's all put there to capture people's minds in these types of ideas. Like essentially, think about what would be the core idea being presented here, if that's the case. If they're trying to infer that Paul was dead, right? Well, it's necromancy, right? And the same thing if you're invoking these Crowleyan ideas with it. You can see how it's kind of got a dark twist to it. It's this inversion principle again. And many people, I've not really researched the Paul is dead thing. to any great detail, but I do know some people that have really taken the whole thing apart and are thoroughly convinced that the original Paul McCartney did die and was replaced with this other guy that now claims to be him. You know, that kind of thing. It's there was even books and stuff written about it. I think it was titled Billy's Back or something like that. I don't know an awful lot about that, but I do recognize that it plays off of some of these occult principles that have been used to socially engineer the masses into a certain type of mindset in our modern era. So that's the important part here, understanding, being able to recognize the archetype being leveraged. Because if you recognize these things on a conscious level, then they don't affect you like as much as they would otherwise. And that's an important part of the sorcery, so to say, that they use. They want people to be ignorant of this stuff or to think it's nonsensical and not recognize what's being leveraged against them, because that's all part of how the magic works, right? That's how they could influence your mind. They could influence it on an unconscious or subconscious level, and then you at the conscious threshold don't even recognize it, and then your behavior changes because of this unconscious thing that's been invoked in you, and you don't even really see it. And you know, and that's the important thing. If we see it for what it is and recognize it and know what it is, then it doesn't affect us as much. So that's why it's important to point these influences out to people, because there's very real power and stuff behind them, even though it's more subjective and experiential rather than it is measurable and objective, so to say. So, you know, people in positions of power recognize these things and do leverage them in various ways. So that's the overarching principle here that needs to be understood.
So another goat comes to mind, and I think we should not leave him out, and that is Azazel.
Yes, that's another important name among the occultists.
Yeah, and he in the Bible he was the scapegoat, and yeah, do you see connections there as well?
Oh, absolutely. The whole scapegoat idea. There's two different goat archetypes and ideas that are heavily leveraged on in social engineering. One is the scapegoat, and the other is the sacrificial goat, right? And these are all things that transcend through times and cultures too. So we have the scapegoat and we have the sacrificial goat. Well, by and large, they like to use world leaders as the scapegoat. Like, for instance, I'll tell you right now, our scapegoat is our president here in the U.S., Joe Biden. They squarely place the blame for everything on this figurehead, right? And that's all these guys are. They're figureheads. They don't have any real power or say in things. They're just the guy put up there to pretty much, right? They're actors. They're actors put in place just to try to put a figurehead in place for everybody to blame things on, first of all. And second of all, they're there to create division. And our last president, Trump, was very effective at this second part, creating division. He did such an excellent job that, you know, that look at the state of the world today because of that. And, you know, and this guy is just doubling down on all that. So they're doing their jobs very effectively here as the scapegoat. Now, what kind of things they get given or offered to take this position, who knows? Who knows what they're promised for doing this? But make no mistake about it, they knowingly accept this role as scapegoat, and they do this for a reason. And there's different occult energies associated with this. And this is actually something that was hinted upon in George Orwell's book, 1984. Remember I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but they had every day what they called the 2-minute hate, where they would put up this picture of Emmanuel Goldstein, and this was the scapegoat, right? Everybody would direct their rage and their negative emotions towards this figure. It's the same kind of thing going on with the scapegoat idea. So that's why they put these leaders in positions of power like this and set them up there to be the scapegoat. And you know what that does? That deflects all of people's negative energies and all of their, so to say, their grievances on this figure. It puts all that energy on this one figure, and that redirects it from the people that are really running things, right? So they don't have that worry. They don't have to worry about getting any kind of backlash for the things they're doing, because guess what? It's going to fall squarely on this guy's shoulders because he's the scapegoat. So they put him up there as the scapegoat. So, you get that idea. But there's also the sacrificial goat idea, which goes hand in hand with this too. So who's the sacrificial goat in many of these instances when it comes to things like what's going on in the world today? Well, by and large, it's the public, right? We're the ones that are the sacrificial goat. They sacrifice our rights and in many times the actual lives of people to these agendas, to fulfill these agendas. So, that's essentially what goes on. It's a form of energy vampirism in a way when you look at it from that context. So they vampirize our energies and they try to redirect our energies in different ways using these principles. So that's part and parcel of what's gone on here and why the pan archetype is so key in this time, because it represents the goat idea, right? And you could even look, even the occult rituals that they put on out there in the public view leverage this archetype. Like look at the opening of the Gothard Tunnel base back in, what was it, like 2016 or something like that, outside of, just outside of where CERN is at, right?
Yeah, I know, St. Gotthard.
Yeah, so it's they use the goat symbolism all over that creepy occult ritual. And not only that, Gothard, that's goat herd, right? When you break down the word goat herd. So it's all about the goat ideas once again. And you could go back and you could look all through like the 20th century and even back into the 1800s and slightly before that too, and see the onset of all this escalating goat symbolism everywhere. It's an important trope.
But St. Gotthard does not stand for goat. God is the German word for God.
Okay, well that's also a play on words then too, right? The goat, the god. I still to this day, I contend that the English language was actually constructed in a way to leverage many of these original etymological meanings of words in different ways to try to invoke different meanings into it. It's kind of a magical language, so to say. It's been constructed purposely for the idea of steering people's minds in misdirecting ways.
Bless you. Did you hear that?
No, what was that? I'm sorry.
I said, bless you, be less you.
Right. Absolutely. See, that's the thing. They've constructed it very carefully in order to be able to do that double entendre with the meanings of words. And that's the thing. I don't know if it's so much like that with other languages as it is here with English. I don't really speak any other language fluidly. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but that's about it. But otherwise, I basically speak English. And that's another way that many cultures in the Western world have been dumbed down. Like I know a lot of people that speak multiple languages. I don't. I feel kind of dumb by contrast, So that you lose a lot of nuance in the language too. Like other languages, they have different, say, gender references for different words, like different objects and stuff take on a certain gender. And there's different ideas like this where there's nuance in language that's lost here in the English language, which makes it more difficult to kind of communicate information effectively. Because there's so much nuance in other language, with less words, you could communicate more information, right? Whereas with English, you have to kind of really talk it through, and sometimes it gets misconstrued anyway, and there's not like any inherent gender quality associated with something or other aspects of language. So it's something that, in my view, has largely been a construct just for the purposes of misdirecting people's minds in many ways. So, that was a mouthful, though. I think we got a little off topic, but still.
Okay, so yeah, that was the first great hour. Let's take a brief break and then we come back. And of course, this is the end of the public hour, and we will see the patrons on the other side. And until next time, stay safe and sound.